Okay, lesson 37 is called Application of Economic Growth. And really, what I want to do in this lesson is just illustrate two of the free response questions that you were assigned in this lesson, just to make sure that you're on the right path. Lesson 36, which is when we really learned about economic growth, was pretty lengthy, so I want to keep this one just a little bit shorter. All right, we're going to start with 2005B number 2 as our first question. And this question starts off by just making a statement. It states that labor productivity is the output per unit of labor. And then it also says that labor productivity is a source of economic growth. Many times in AP macroeconomics questions, free response questions, the actual beginning of the question has relevant information that you need to know to answer the question. In this case, that's not really true. These are just general statements that anybody who's studied economic growth would know. They're not really related to the question. The question itself starts here with part A. Identify two sources of increased labor productivity. Now remember what labor productivity is. It's anything that makes a worker more productive. Now that seems obvious. Or in other words, what makes one worker able to produce more than he or she used to. That's labor productivity. So what might be included? Well, the truth is there's many things. It could be more human capital. It could be more education, and education is actually a form of human capital. Remember, human capital is anything that makes a human more able to do their job. Maybe it's training, maybe experience, maybe it's education. Improved technology certainly could make a worker more productive. More resources, more natural resources. A worker who doesn't have enough natural resources can't ultimately do anything. And we should highlight we really need more productive natural resources. And then lastly, we should highlight that we do not, and this would not be a good answer, not more labor. Merely adding bodies is not going to increase labor productivity. It would increase economic growth. But they specifically ask in this part of the question about labor productivity. How much can one laborer produce? More labor will not help that one laborer produce more. Okay, let's move on to part B. Part B says, assume the economy is at full employment. Labor productivity has been rising. Using a correctly labeled graph of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve, show the long run impact of economic growth on productivity on each of the following. And it mentions that we have to do real output and on the price level. So really what we're looking for here is a graph, right? We're going to be using an aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph to show how labor productivity increases have affected economic growth. And here we go. Here is our first long run aggregate supply curve. You see it sitting there right in the middle. We'll draw in our short run supply curve and our short run demand curve. And that, of course, now shows that we are, in fact, in long run equilibrium. So that's really the first part of the question. We're in long run equilibrium. Notice, of course, as always, that I've labeled my y-axis with my P for price level and my x-axis with my RGDP. Now, at this point, we have experienced an increase in labor productivity. What that means is that workers will be able to produce more. So that means economic growth is increasing. And we've already learned that we can illustrate that by showing a shift to the right of the long run aggregate supply curve. Now you'll notice what that means is that full employment GDP has gone from Y1 down here to Y2, meaning that we need to employ more resources to be at full employment. Because workers are more productive, each worker can do more of the work. So we need to actually produce more to employ all of our workers. Now, one of the other things that we should note is that not only, remember, anything that affects the long run supply generally also affects the short run supply curve because it's lowering the cost of production if we're more productive. And so the supply curve shifts to the right. It also means that in the end, we have a lower equilibrium price, and as we already mentioned, a greater RGDP. So we have our equilibrium price decreased and our RGDP increased. And that satisfies the answer to part B. Now let's finish up with part C. It says, assume the economy produces only two goods, good X and good Y. Using a correctly labeled graph of the production possibilities diagram, show the impact of an increase in productivity. Okay, remember our PPF allows us to illustrate two different goods at one time. So here is our PPF. I've got good X and good Y on the alternate axes. It would not matter which axes you put it on. And then what you can see here is we've had a second line drawn in that shows an expansion of economic growth. We assume here that the blue was our initial line and that the red is our new production possibilities curve. We've pushed outward because our economic growth has occurred. You may wish to include some arrows just to illustrate that that's what's happened in your answer. Okay, that's 2005B number 2. Now let's look at one more question. Okay, we're going to move on to AP FRQ 2005 number 2, not to be confused with 2005B number 2, which is what we just did. Okay, in this question, they give you a graph of the loanable funds market, which you see over here. And they also make this statement, just that the graph shows the loanable funds market for a country. Okay, Part A says, assume the country's government increases deficit spending. Explain how the increase in deficit spending will affect real interest rates. Well, remember what deficit spending does. Deficit spending means that the government is essentially using up some of the savings that the public has saved and therefore is decreasing the supply of loanable funds. Remember, the supply of loanable funds is made up of savings. So if I click in here my pen, I'm going to use this since they gave us a graph, and I'm going to draw in my second supply of loanable funds. We'll label that S2. There we go. And what I'll notice is that my interest rates in this case have risen from an interest rate at this level originally to an interest rate at this level. Interest rates have risen. So how do I actually go about explaining this? All that graphing, by the way, was extraneous. You did not have to graph it. I just wanted to illustrate it for your visualization purposes. To see the actual answer, this is all you had to really write. An increased deficit, the increased deficits mean that there is a decrease in the supply of loanable funds. This will increase real interest rates. And that's what happened. Very straightforward. We've done this quite a few times before. This is sort of review. Okay, moving on to Part B. Part B says, indicate how the change in interest rates identified in Part A will affect investment in plant and equipment. Now, Part A, of course, we said that interest rates rose. And it says in this question to simply indicate. And if it does only say indicate, believe it or not, it really can be almost just a one-word answer. In fact, in this case, it could be just a one-word answer. Higher interest rates means that it will be more expensive to invest in almost anything that requires a loan, particularly things like plant. Plant is a funny word for things like factories, very, very large investments in capital, and equipment, which is also generally considered capital. So the answer is a decrease. I put in parentheses because of higher real interest rates, but technically in this question you didn't even have to put that. You could have just said decrease. All right, now to Part C. Explain how the change in real interest rates identified in Part A will affect long-run economic growth. All right, here's the key point. We have higher interest rates, and the magic word here, folks, we need to see is the word capital. And let's see what I put. Economic growth will decrease because of a decrease in capital stock. There will not be as much investment in capital because interest rates will make it more difficult to borrow the money to do that. The key word in this case is capital. Again, if you had just wrote economic growth will decrease because of a decrease in investment, that's not going to work in this case. We need to understand that it's specifically surrounding interest rates, specifically affect our ability to invest in capital, and that's what affects our ability to achieve economic growth. Okay, you have one more free response question to try in this module. Please get to it, and thanks very much.